And this is something that I sort of added to my work over the summer and in the spring with the help of the eScience Institute's Data Science and AI Accelerator. So hopefully for folks who are, curious about data science and using AI in their research, but not as familiar with it. This will be instructive in the sense that like I didn't know anything about any of this 6 months ago. And I've been able to learn a lot with the help from the eScience Institute. So, and the other thing I'll say is like this is work with Curtis Atkisson, who is my accelerator liaison, and helped me through the process. So he really taught me a lot of this and helped work through all the details of all this research with me. The last thing I'll say is I'm going to go for about 15 minutes and we'll have some time for questions hopefully after that. But if you have a question as I go, feel free to raise your hands. I know people come from like a lot of disciplinary backgrounds. So if something is not making sense, or if you just have like a clarifying question, feel free to raise your hand. If it's something a little bit more substantive, then maybe we can put it to the end of the presentation, but just wanted to say that. Okay, so my research really focuses on this new program that we have in Washington State. You might have heard that, in Washington, we obviously have a lot of issues around housing insecurity, housing affordability, and as a result, we have a lot of evictions. Now, an eviction is just a civil court case that's filed by a landlord against somebody who's either behind on their rent or has violated a lease in some other way. And research from sociology and from socio-legal studies a little bit has sort of shown that not only are evictions like a symptom of people who are, of living in poverty or not being able to pay rent, but they can also make things a lot worse. And so there's been a lot of research on how to prevent or mitigate the harms of evictions. And in Washington, during the pandemic, we were the first state to pass a law that says if your income is below 200% of the federal poverty line, you're eligible for a court-appointed attorney. So this is called like a tenant right to counsel program, if you've heard of that. Now, there is some available data on eviction filings, which is just like the number of evictions that are filed, and then the filing rate, which is that number divided by the population of renter households, and then also eviction rates, which is the rate at which those cases turn into judgments. So there's some data available on evictions, and we can sort of look at how the right to counsel program has influenced that, but it's still really unclear, like what's the relationship between having legal assistance and projector shutdown in progress. That's good. Let's see, send to left projector. Okay, I think that should.
Okay, yes.
Okay, so that's what my research is all about. And really, I'm trying to unpack this like black box of eviction. So we just don't know what happens in eviction court, and there's not really good data available. So that's what a lot of my research focuses on. Okay, the key thing to understand here is that if you see research or media reports about evictions, that's just mostly measuring the number of evictions that have been filed without any other data points. And this diagram is like a dramatically oversimplified picture of what happens during an eviction. So these are complex legal processes, and they can take, some of them happen, they're basically the judgment happens the same day that the case is filed. They can also take months or even years to resolve. So there's a lot of complexity there that's not really represented in much of the research and the media reports about this stuff. So I have sort of a series of questions that guided me as I was applying for this accelerator program, and just starting to think about the different data that might be out there and how we can create better data sources on this kind of black box. And basically, first I wanted to just try to understand, can we identify what is the percentage of cases that result in an eviction judgment or result in a record sealing order where somebody has their record protected from tenant screening companies in the future? And also, can we start to map people's paths through the process and understand what are the, percentage of people who are able to engage with the eviction process, and how does that relate to people being able to access legal representation down the road? And then lastly, I'm also curious about what is the effect, or, what associations can we identify about whether somebody gets legal representation and how that relates to their case outcomes. Most of you are probably not familiar with court data and eviction data, but it's not very good. And basically, a lot of this data is maintained in structured or sometimes even kind of unstructured groups of PDF documents that are available on these county-based web portals. So logistically speaking, it's very difficult to access any sort of volume of this data. And it has taken a lot of work even to get to the point where we measure the number of eviction filings. And that's kind of why we have this challenge of not being able to understand what goes on in these cases most of the time. So there's sort of a logistical challenge. And then also there's this data science challenge of like, even if we could get all these PDFs, what do we do with them? So that's what my project was all about. There is a researcher who some of you might be familiar with named Tim Thomas, who used to work at the eScience Institute and was a sociology PhD student here, who did a lot of work to get us to the point where we understand how many evictions happen in Washington. And him and his team were able to share basically all of the documents that have been filed in eviction cases in Pierce County, which is just south where Tacoma is, in Pierce County Superior Court between 2022 and 24. Since the Right to Counsel program started in 2021, this is kind of like the biggest set of data that is available about a right to counsel program at a statewide level. And although this is only at a county level for now, it does kind of start to open up some possibilities about what we could do if we can get this kind of data at a larger scale. We had a few different options for how to look at this data. The first thing to know is that in the scraping process, all these PDFs are basically scraped from the county-based web portal that I mentioned. The documents are actually labeled. So you can create some semblance of what happened in the case just by the names of the documents that are filed. And so that was our first process, is just saying like, if we create an algorithm to try to identify like what documents are filed in what cases and maybe filter out some documents with misleading names, can we start to identify some of what happened in these cases? We also tried to look using some tools from Azure's Document Intelligence, Microsoft product. Just if we look at like the layout of the documents, can we extract valuable information from that just by saying like, if there's a table and it lists the plaintiff and the defendant, the landlord and the tenant, can we identify what, who their attorneys are, what their names are? Is there any structured, information that we can extract from that? The answer to that is no. All these documents are filed by different landlords. Some of them are filed by, different landlords firms, and there's basically a lot of heterogeneity in the images that come out of these documents. And so that was not really a valuable approach. And the last thing, and that's what I'm going to be spending most of my time today talking about, is retrieval-augmented generation. And I'll get into the details of that. So first, just to briefly go over what we found with the algorithmic document search, because I do think it's valuable. I had all this theory and I had done some inductive analysis and like hand coding of documents prior to this project. And I had identified like, what are the names of documents where tenants submit a response to the filing? Is there, a set of document names that we could look at to be able to identify what those might be? And overall, I was able to come up with basically a list of different documents and what they say about an eviction case. Does a tenant respond? Do they show up to their hearing? Do they get access to an attorney? And create some, pretty decent measures. And looking at those documents and the stages of the eviction process, and you don't need to worry too much about the details of the different stages, because that does get pretty legal and technical. But you can see that with this small set of variables, this is just 6 variables from these cases, but we got some pretty good reliability in terms of, being able to check this with hand coding. I basically selected 30 cases each from 2022, 2023, and 2024, and found pretty high rates of alignment. You can see tenant representation is a little bit lower because that sometimes requires reading through documents. And again, at this stage, we're just looking at the literal names of the documents. So, got some pretty good reliable data, but not too many variables. The next stage is trying to understand and read through the words in all of these documents. So this is like 195,000 PDFs, obviously not something we could do manually, but if you can, I had observed that by reading through these documents manually one at a time, you can actually extract some valuable information from that. So we got a grant from the eScience Institute to be able to basically use some Azure credits for this project. And I think, this is something that we've spent like less than $10,000 in Azure credits on. So it's really not that it's all that expensive. It's just that you need access to these tools to be able to do it. And basically, you know, we started with that document identification where we had the names of the documents. Then we basically selected a subset of those documents. And well, first of all, we fed all the documents into optical character recognition product from Azure, which is they basically have a portal and you feed all these documents in and then you read through them all with OCR and you just extract the raw text. So like each document has a long string of text attached to it. And then from there, we basically fed that text from certain documents back into the into document intelligence and asked it to use ChatGPT 4.0, which is relatively inexpensive LLM to create, we created some prompts and basically we were like, does this document say that the tenant attended the hearing, and created a whole, schema for that. And so from that, we were able to create some JSON objects that basically have like, the variable and the value and a confidence score. And then, now I'm in this process of cleaning and merging and analyzing everything. And you can see how I feel about that. So these were the document types that we ended up landing on. The summons is the document that is basically starts the eviction. That's when the landlord, files it in court and says, I'm initiating a civil case against you. The complaint is a document that describes what the tenant has done to violate the lease. So this could have like a monetary amount that they owe. This could say, what are the things that they've been doing to violate the lease beyond not paying rent. There are appearance documents, which to me has always been a very strong indicator that a tenant is kind of aware of what's going on. They might file a response, and this is sometimes like an email that they send to their landlord that the landlord files in the court. This is sometimes a legal form that they go to the court and fill out and then submit themselves. So these documents look a lot of different, there's a lot of different formats, and that's why the document layout analysis didn't work very well. Hearing minutes, which are actually quite standardized because they're generated and submitted by the court, and that has information about what happened in the hearing. Usually the details about the hearing proceeding are quite limited, but there is information there about who was there. And then also we extracted information about like the agreements that tenants and landlords came to. So did it require the tenant to move? Was there a monetary judgment? That kind of thing. And you can see across all of these, I have a case number that I extract for all of these. So that's a good way to be able to link documents throughout this. In terms of what it looks like, basically the OCR went through and I have redacted this because it contains like identifying information, but you can see this is kind of what it looks like when it gets parsed into a data frame. Like that's an example of one small snippet from, one part of a line of a CSV. And it just comes out as like a string of text. It is kind of structured, but also, needs to be parsed pretty significantly. But you can see, for example, in the middle, the case number jumps out pretty clearly. And it's so pretty decent quality in terms of that. And then from there, that's when we prompt ChatGPT to say, read through each of these text strings and, give us JSON objects that we can use to put into a data frame and then do analysis based on that. Comparing this method to the algorithmic document search that I described, it's kind of interesting looking at the comparison of alignment versus hand coding. So first of all, the reason I'm not using like accuracy here is because actually, when I checked hand coding versus what the RAG procedure was producing, 15% of the conflicts were errors from hand coding. So it kind of made me think that like all this research I've been doing, like actually there are cases where the computer is doing better than I am, which is quite interesting. And so that's why I use the term alignment instead of accuracy. But you can see like basically what's happening here is we get more variables from RAG than we're able to do from the document search. And overall, it improves the accuracy, but I still have a couple of iterations. This is basically, I ran RAG once as kind of an experimental thing, hand coded to try to identify errors, ran it again, and this is the second iteration. So I think going through that process a couple more times will be helpful. And this is also done without incorporating the confidence scores that the LLM spat out. So that's another thing that I need to incorporate and figure out how to model as well. But you can see overall, like the average alignment is lower for RAG, but there's a lot more information that we can pull out. So that's why I think it's a little bit, more valuable to be able to use that procedure and refine it to the point where we get higher precision over time. And I have a bunch of outcome slides and kind of analysis slides that I can show, but I'm just going to put this one up before I kind of wrap up here. Basically, like this is the value of this kind of data. So if you look at the top left and the bottom right here, you can see the light blue lines is over time, cases in which the tenant was represented, and the dark blue is unrepresented. And like the case outcomes in 2022 and 2023, it seems like tenants were having much better case outcomes on average than unrepresented tenants. And then as COVID era rental assistance lapsed, so this is like this is the funds that was coming from the federal government going to counties and states and was then dispersed through all these rental assistance programs. As those kind of go away, the apparent benefit of having legal representation really appears to diminish. And again, these are not like 100% accurate data yet, but there's a really big, it doesn't really appear that you're more likely to be evicted via an eviction judgment if you don't have legal representation, which is probably a little bit surprising to some folks. The bottom right figure is a measure that I created of court displacement, which basically combines final eviction judgments that were not overturned with agreements for the tenant to move. So this really kind of casts doubt on the idea that providing somebody with an attorney is actually like an anti-displacement measure. There might be important benefits for people, but avoiding displacement based on this does not appear to be one of them. And on the bottom left, on the other hand, you can see like there's something called an order for limited dissemination, which basically means third-party tenant screening providers cannot share your eviction record with landlords in the future. And you can see there's dramatic differences throughout this time span in terms of whether somebody's able to access an attorney. So there are a few people who are able to go through that process without an attorney, but it's really not very many. And you have a pretty solid rate, over the course of this period, say about half of people are able to get their records protected when they have access to an attorney. So that's a really big difference. And then the dismissals pattern on the top right, that kind of follows what you see in eviction judgments, but in reverse. So I have some different challenges that I'm able to talk about. I think this might be better to address, like, depending on what questions people have, but basically at each stage, this was my first time doing something like this, so I ran into all sorts of problems, and I thought this might be useful if other people are interested in this. For example, in OCR, like throughout the course's process, I learned that there are sort of like predictable errors that come out when you do OCR and you're trying to extract handwritten text and typed text in all these different formats. And you can sort of learn how to deal with those. And then it also taught me a lot about using LLMs and what things LLMs understand and what they don't. And this is where I really need to look at the confidence scores to be able to refine my data as well. And so I will stop there. Basically, what my plans are for next steps here is you can think about each stage of the RAG procedure. I want to try to improve precision at each stage of that. So, for example, like if you look at my measure of monetary complaints against tenants, which is how much are you behind on rent as alleged in the complaint, those are only accurate in about 75% of cases. And that's because the OCR is having issues picking up, dollar signs and zeros and eights and commas, and I haven't really been able to address that yet. And so that's kind of just a cleaning stage that I need to be able to learn a little bit more about OCR and create a process for cleaning that. And then at the next stage, I want to be able to identify high quality LLM output as opposed to less certain output, and be able to use that to develop like more precise measures of all my variables. And then lastly, I definitely have started thinking about what are the potential expansions of this project. Again, as I mentioned, this data is really hard to access, but it's there. Like all of these PDF documents are online somewhere, and you can go look at them. It's just a process of scraping them. You need approval for, potentially you need to be able to pay for it. And then from there, you need to be able to run brag on it to be able to understand what's actually in the documents. So I think that's my last slide. I'll stop there and happy to take any questions.